Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Todd Fernandez with Climate Crisis Policy, and I'll be your host today. Thank you all for joining us to discuss the most important organizing challenge humanity has ever faced: how to unite in common cause, to join as one humanity to protect our sacred planet. In the first session, we had a great gathering of elected officials and other leaders who endorsed the idea of a collective comprehensive bill, while also focusing us on more immediate goals. The upshot was an enthusiastic invitation for massive outside pressure, and that's where we all come in. In session 2, we welcomed a wonderful array of leaders from major environmental and science organizations, and MIT and Project Drawdown offered to lead a scientific advisory committee to assess the greenhouse gas impacts of proposed bills. And the group generally agreed that there was a need for greater coalition infrastructure to unite all the various circles, perhaps a climate Congress convening of all parties or coalition of coalitions. In session 3, we welcomed a wonderful array of leaders from a variety of areas: farming, environmental justice, unions, lobbying groups, doctors, teachers, indigenous women, and faith. We had an interesting conversation about their various focuses. In session 4, we had another great group of coalitions: environmental justice and psychiatrists. That's this session, in session 4. Which we're all going to need to get through this. I'm so glad the psychiatrists are in the house. Our conversation is the same across the groups. What is the federal climate legislative strategy in the United States? And perhaps more importantly for this session, how do we unite civil society, big picture, in a common effort? How do we make sure the process for drafting a comprehensive bill is inclusive and transparent? And how do we bring all the sectors together for each other's goals and the collective goals? By way of comparison, a comprehensive immigration bill is the first priority for President Biden, and that is no accident. A nationwide network led by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the ACLU, and state-level coalitions like the New York Immigration Coalition, which has over 200 members and a 36-person staff just for the coalition, made that happen, starting with their push in 2010. I was in that battle for comprehensive reform under Obama, and it was a revelation of organizing infrastructure. And I dream of this for the Earth, which could have the largest coalition ever if we choose to build it. So welcome all as we create a plan for unity that will make the scientific solutions politically mandatory by changing the political reality from the outside until we are confident and clear that a new trajectory has been forged for our home, the incredible, miraculous planet Earth, from which all of us and all of nature is born and nourished with abundance, now all threatened by the powerful greed of a few. So now is the time for humanity to protect Mother Earth from corporations. The challenge is not the opposition or science. It is internal among us, among organizations and activists. If we can unite, everything else is possible. From yesterday, I think there's enough momentum to say that we are going to embark on a process to draft a comprehensive climate bill together in community. So the discussion about whether and why to do this is a bit resolved, but I'll still share what I was already saying about this. When it comes to strategy, often the debate centers on political pragmatism and an assessment of what's possible if we're counting the votes in the moment without an outside strategy. It also often ends up being an internal compromise before the bill even gets written or the fight begins. I believe we must write and file a comprehensive gold standard bill to use as a rallying cry for the masses. And by so doing, we'll set the goalpost for the dream, the aspiration that will invite the most passionate activist I've ever met to uncommon valor. There's, of course, also incremental change. We can advance sooner, and that is great, especially given the timeline we're up against. But once we have a big vision, we can then identify the piecemeal parts to move faster and check those off the list. And by having both the big picture to mobilize the grassroots and the individual bills, we are no longer creating a strategic conflict between these approaches, but rather a synergy that creates unimaginable possibilities. We're not starting from scratch. Our Climate Crisis Policy Digest, which is essentially our whole website, is the collection of 150 expert reports, bills, and laws, with the specific policies excerpted and organized by Project Drawdown greenhouse sources. This shows the lay of the land on policy from all the experts and communities and is intended to show the commonality among groups on various goals. And there are also many good bills recently filed in various parts of the puzzle on fracking, plastics, hydrofluorocarbons, regenerative farming, ending fossil fuel tax subsidies, pesticides, new ones in the works to ban banks from financing new fossil fuel projects, to outlawing imported products from illegally deforested lands globally, which is my favorite because we're going to protect the orangutans. There's a Justice for Black Farmers bill. There's a carbon fee bill. There's Environmental Justice for All Act. So we can start to assemble this whole picture working from these parts. And that's what we've done in our group, which is a network of local grassroots activists. We put together the climate bill package, which is also on the website, to begin uniting the advocacy groups within congressional districts to lobby for these as a package. For this, individual local groups are adopting their district and organizing many coalitions, and everyone is invited to this. Please check out the website. But this is only a beta example of what could happen with a comprehensive bill or compilation of bills and collective district campaigns organized by all the environmental groups simultaneously to unite all the passions of all the individual interest groups, which then starts to build the level of power required to win. Another key question in movement and legislative strategy is who's leading the charge? In my experience, we should not wait for Congress to write and lead on bills. And Senator Merkley and Representative Tlaib and Representative Levin at our opening session were very welcoming of the idea of civil society drafting its own bill. So it's almost a moot point, but I didn't know that going into it. Civil society should identify the solutions and lead the effort just like the corporations do. We did this in the gay rights movement with the Equality Act, and the Breathe Act is another example. Another issue that comes up is whether a bill can pass right away. To which I say, you don't file the bills you think you can pass. You file the bills with the outcomes you want. And in this case, need scientifically. Then you organize around those and build your power and then start counting the votes. The negotiations with Congress at the end of that journey with a mass movement in motion will be very different than they appear today. And ultimately, Congress will make the tough decisions. We don't have to agree among ourselves about everything. We can have different camps lobbying their passions like we do now. While we all work together on the big picture, and that's just fine. Imagine if all our groups lobbied the same day, if all our social media had the same message and call to action, if all our legislative directors and organizers were working as a team to divvy up the 435 congressional districts, building many coalitions and going after the votes. This is already done for get out the vote efforts at some level. So I invite everyone to imagine a new world of possibilities. Because we have the capacity to do this. All we need is the plan and the demand. From earlier sessions, it's clear that there is an inevitable tendency to focus on policy themes. I already talked to this panel about that, so I think we're going to be a little bit more on cue. And by the time we got to the mechanics of coalition building and what's missing, we were just getting started. So I ask everyone to please start off on point in your opening by sharing their coalition insights, what you see as the macro coalition infrastructure of the climate movement as a whole today, and what it could be, how you're structured and operate, especially to collectively draft legislation. All of that can help inform how we might unite various coalitions with some sort of superstructure of organizing and a process for legislative drafting together. If we can create individual coalitions focused on specific issues, and coalitions can write single issue bills, then we can create one big one and a coalition of coalitions focused on the whole. But how? The collective wisdom of this group could point the way. And this audience is quite expert in all the underlying policy issues. Many people are. What we need to focus on now is macro coalition building, and the policy discussions will come later. Last, I just want to add that I believe it's critical that this be an open, inclusive, and transparent process. How we start off matters. How the bill is drafted matters. Insider secret plans and invite-only coalitions will not inspire the devotion of the masses. Everyone must be welcome, included from the outset. And as scary as that might sound to some, and I understand those concerns, it is doable with a well-managed process. So please also add your thoughts on this concept. It's central because we're aiming to build a real mass movement. We're not playing inside politics, but rather looking to build community that will then sprint to action out of passion and commitment because they were there from the beginning. Welcome again, and thank you all for coming. I'm so happy you're here, and it's a true honor to be with you all. So we'll get started now, going around for 5-minute open remarks on this central question: what is the National Climate Legislative Strategy? And how is civil society organized, or how can it be organized to collectively achieve results? First up, we have Jake Davis, Senior Policy Advisor from Family Farm Action Alliance. Jake, it's a pleasure to have you here. And Family Farm Action has been a deep partner with us as we embarked on this journey this year and brought in lots of farm and groups. They were there yesterday, and Family Farm Action is working on just this exact question: crafting legislation in community, building coalitions around it, and then implementing action plans, as many of you are on this call, actually. So welcome, Jake. And we know Jake has to cut out for a little bit. He's going to a Biden transition meeting at 1, and he'll be back at 1:30-ish. So we'll lose him a little bit in the middle. So welcome, Jake. Please take it away.
Thanks, Todd, for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks to your all's work for convening this big agenda. It is a significant undertaking, and it's going to take that inclusive vision of leadership that you're describing to win out on these issues. I want to start out just briefly by quickly introducing myself and Family Farm Action. My name is Jake Davis. I've worked in rural farm and food politics policy for a number of years. And Family Farm Action and Family Farm Action Alliance were really formed to take on this broad issue of developing political muscle for family farmers and working rural people. And we think that the climate crisis is one of those significant issues, much like for all of you on this call, that will unite those folks in those areas. And I say that because there has been much made over the last 4 years, and then obviously after the recent presidential and general election that we had, about an urban-rural divide. We actually don't believe that there's as much of an urban-rural divide as many people would argue. What we believe is that there is a divide between multinational corporations and the vast majority of working folks. And we believe that independent family farmers and rural citizens have as much in common with folks in urban areas and suburban areas, particularly on the issue of climate change. It affects us all. It affects our livelihoods. It affects the way that we go about doing our work. It affects us in so many ways, and it affects the future of not only our children and their children, but the future of our natural world, the things that we care so much about. So we think that we're incredibly united in those efforts, but what we have seen is a huge number of forces that have found ways and worked on ways to divide us. And when we started our work in the climate arena. And really, when we began our work on any of these issues, we worked heavily with a number of legislative offices to draft legislation like the Climate Stewardship Act and the Farm System Reform Act. We begin to ask ourselves, who are those people that have not had a seat at the table and who have not been asked for their creative solutions about these issues? And we do our very best to reach out to those folks and start to be the political muscle and the voice that represents those rural folks who feel deep down despair and desperation that they have often been, left out of the conversation. And that is unfortunately a bipartisan despair. Ultimately, we know that rural economies in rural America recovered from the 2009 2007 2008 crisis from 2009 on at a much less rate than even urban areas did. So we know that those economic crises exist in rural America, and we know that there is sort of immediate desperation from those folks who need reforms now and need real relief. But we also know that those folks can be allies in building a climate solution that creates a real new green economy that puts those people back to work, that helps our farmers transition to a more sustainable future that that not only reduces agricultural emissions but becomes a place that captures carbon. We know that there's a whole new generation of farmers and ranchers embracing the idea of regenerative production. So not just production that doesn't harm the planet, but actually production that builds soil health and that increases the environmental contribution of farmers and ranchers. We know that there's a whole host of folks in rural America who are eager and excited about renewable energy sources and putting more wind and solar and small businesses and farms. We know that that movement is developing and exists, but it hasn't yet been harnessed for a legislative strategy. And so our attempt over the last several years has been to bring to the table those folks so that we can address and draft big legislation that works on those issues. Maybe not at the scale that Todd is hopeful for and we are hopeful for as a broader coalition, but definitely on the scale that addresses those issues in rural America. So we're eager to find ways to even broaden that coalition and find ways for your organizations to help better talk about rural America and to rural America so that we can make sure that those legislative constituents are hearing that we all have a united voice.
Thank you, Jake. Jake, you coined a new phrase, bipartisan despair. I like it. If we can't unite around anything, we can unite around our despair.
Yep.
I'm a little slap happy. I didn't get a lot of sleep, so excuse me. That's great. And I always love talking to Jake because he can put in words what I'm struggling to articulate because he's been, talking about this for a while. Thank you so much. All right, next up we have, I'm not sure if Cornelius is with us yet. Oh yes, great. Cornelius, you're here. Welcome.
Thank you.
So good to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us. Cornelius, when I first talked with him and I saw their website, they organize co-ops, and then they have a dispute resolution process for land title issues. And I thought co-op mentalities, I work with a lot of, I'll talk about that another time, communities that deal with co-ops and dispute mediation are really the tools we might need to bring everybody together. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts on how you create coalition and co-op and how you work through the struggles of all the different personalities to bring unity together. And it's 5 minutes for opening remarks and you'll hear a little bell when it's time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Todd, and thanks for everybody who made this happen. Really, we appreciate the opportunity to be able to address this audience around this topic because so very few times we are in these conversations. And I think is extremely important. And going back to some of the things that Jake talked about, really to really talk about climate change, to really impact climate change and look at it, we have to look at it from a holistic point of view. And that means bringing everybody in the camp, because you can solve the problem in one community, in one area, and don't solve it in the other, and the problem hasn't been solved. And so some of the things you talked about from the beginning, Todd, around the common good, I think that's in danger. And that's something that we don't look at as a country, as a nation, much anymore. And it's critical. And so let me step back and introduce myself and my organization, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. I'm Cornelius Blanding. I'm the executive director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. I've been with the Federation now for 23 years, but as its executive director for 5 now. What the Federation is, simply put, is a cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives. And we're chartered to work all around the South. We're the oldest and largest cooperative association of Black farmers and cooperatives in the nation. We're a 53-year-old organization. We developed directly out of the civil rights movement. And to get at your question, Todd, or your point about cooperatives, is that has always been our strategy from the beginning. The Federation was founded by 22 cooperatives, 22 organizations that were created by small farmers, landowners, and limited resource folks throughout their communities who organized around a common good, a common problem, a common challenge, with the recognition that one individual or a few individuals couldn't solve the problem that were before them. At that time, it was the civil rights issues of the day, discrimination and other kind of issues, which we still face today in various forms. But I'm excited to be here because, again, not very often are we having these conversations within our cooperatives, within our communities around climate change. When we do have them, we're having them, but they're not framed or in the same language that folks in the climate change community may be having them. And therefore, folks in the climate change community might not recognize the value of not only our organization, but of our cooperatives, of small farmers, of Black farmers, of really being at this table. And so one of the questions you asked from the beginning about the national climate change strategy. I am not an expert in climate change, and I'm not going to profess to be or talk like I am, but I do know our communities, our work, our organization, and I speak about it from that perspective. For us, when we hear climate change, we think about it that it's a very fragmented strategy at this date. It's done on the national level by folks like the Department of Agriculture, particularly the National Resource Conservation Service. We see their work around that as an isolated strategy. We see organizations like Jake's organization on a private scale in terms of a community-based organization or privately, we see that work happening there. We even see that work happening or talked about in the philanthropic community, but we don't see a national strategy around it. But when we are engaged, we're engaged usually at the level of the Department of Agriculture, NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service. But we're engaged in at a point where we don't know if they even understand what the national strategy is. But we do know that when our government goes out and talks on the world stage, it talks about climate change. But when it talks about it, it doesn't know how to come back and implement some of those things it's talked about, because the reality of our country is that it's primarily private landowners. So whatever strategy we have to have a strategy as a nation through private landowners, and private landowners have to understand that strategy. And we as a Black community, as Black farmers and landowners, we don't understand it. Now, so that's the challenge, but we're eager to make sure that our work in particular is carried out as in a national strategy, as part of a national strategy. But how do we get to that? That's the challenge. That is the question. But we're eager to continue doing this work, and we're eager to do it with others, not only the government, but with private foundations, with corporations, with community-based organizations, with the philanthropic community. And what that looks like, yet to be seen. But the reality is we have to be at the table also, because our lands are contiguous. And you can make strategy changes or make corrections on one piece of land and don't make it on the other, and you have not solved the problem. Because at the end of the day, this is about protecting our air, our water, and our soil. And farmers including Black farmers at the forefront of that. They're on the vanguard of that. And we have to build any strategy around all coming to the table. Because on a wholesale, from a wholesale point of view, we're not talking about renewable energies. We're not talking about carbon sequestration. We're not talking about climate change. What we're talking about in the Black community is Black land loss. And that Black land loss is at the forefront of this. And so we all have to understand all of our issues, each other's issues, and then find that common good and know that what affects one of us affects all. And how do we really start looking at it from all different perspectives? And then, as you mentioned in the beginning, Todd, find that piece we have in common and work from there. I'll stop there and answer questions or talk further as we go along.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. That was a beautiful setting of this whole conversation. It really was. And so in the next round, I would love if you could just share a couple principles of creating co-ops. That's the word. Because I think that would help for people to start thinking about, that's really the mentality that we have to get into. All right, next up we have Ken Berlin, who's president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project. One of my favorite projects because they've trained an army of people to understand and teach and present on the whole picture of the climate crisis that we're in. And now the potential to pivot them to a solutions-based advocacy team that hooks up with all the other coalitions and starts lobbying for solutions or comprehensive bill. That just, my mind starts to explode just at this one collaboration opportunity. Now alone with all the other groups that we've talked to. So Ken, welcome. We love your group, and Corinna Gore's been extremely helpful, and Harriet Sugarman and Rosalind from the New York Climate Reality Chapter. They were on the host committee, Harriet was, for this. So we're grateful to have you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Welcome. Oh, you're on mute. You're muted, Ken.
Thanks, Todd. I'd like to start off by telling a little bit about Climate Reality Project. As Todd says, we train people to become what we call climate reality leaders. This year, we did 2 virtual trainings for the first time, and we trained in one 9-day session and one 7-day session. We trained 9,700 people, people who graduated from that, and we had criteria to graduate from the session. When those are over, when that's over, they join our existing list of climate reality leaders. We now in the United States have 140 chapters. We also have 11 offices outside the United States. We have 140 chapters in the United States. When people enter the chapters and other people join the chapters or are climate reality leaders, they're going to be focusing this year on federal legislation and working in coalitions to pass the legislation we need to address the climate crisis. I'd like to start off by talking about one aspect of legislation that I think it's important to think about, and that is what happens, because it's important to coalition building, what happens when that overall piece of legislation that we all agree upon gets into Congress and the Congress starts stripping out provisions from the legislation. How do we that's when I think coalitions can have a hard time holding together. That's when people can sort of go off and start making private deals and the kind of non-transparency that Todd mentioned to start with. So how do we avoid that? And I think what we have to do in drafting legislation is coming up with a multi-layered approach to the legislation where we decide in advance that when certain things come out, there are other things we can do to make up for that. And just an example is, suppose there's a mandate in the legislation that says by 2035, as Biden says, there should be, all energy should be generated by clean and renewable energy and none of it by fossil fuel-based energy. What if that provision comes out of the bill? As quite frankly, this Congress, it might very well. It seems to me we don't have to give up on that concept. We can still, as a coalition, still continue to work towards achieving that result by looking at what is the executive branch doing, what can we do at the state level, and then what can we do at the federal level? What kind of legislation can put us on the path to achieving that goal, even though that goal is now out of the legislation? What series of measures are necessary to, let's say, by 2025, ensure we're on target? What can we do by 2030 to ensure we're on a target? And so I think if we look at this as a multi-level strategy, I think the legislation worked better, but importantly, it will hold the coalitions together. It will give us a common ground to look at things as the legislation progresses. The second question is, of course, how do we reach out to other groups and how do we work together? And I think there we've got to develop a series of narratives that make us all understand the issues we're dealing with and what really are the priorities of the other coalitions we're working with. And as an example of that, if we look at the environmental justice movement, it's important to recognize one fact that could be easily ignored, which is poor communities of color, have in fact suffered from pollution and will suffer from the climate crisis much more than other communities. I think everybody recognizes that. But while we're trying to address the issue, while we're reducing the pollution, while we're closing down the coal plants, it's not enough to say that we're going to close coal plants between now and 2035. We have to think of what happens to the people. What are the human impacts on people of this contamination while this process is going on, while things are being closed down? So in looking at this, we have to figure out how we can address, in this case, in environmental justice communities, how we can address in the interim the harm that's being done by the existing plants before they're shut down. And that requires a whole different set of measures than just figuring out what are the policy measures you need to shut down those plants. So it's something we need to pay up a lot of attention to. We also need to pay a lot of attention to the fact that in communities of color and communities without capital, that they may not realize the great benefits of this transition to clean energy. Transition to clean energy is going to lower everybody's costs. It's going to reduce the energy burden that is so important to address in communities of color and poorer communities. And so what do we do to make sure that those communities have the capital they need, they have the ability to benefit from this great revolution we're doing? How do we make sure that they can put rooftop solar on their homes, do community solar, do the energy efficiency measures that are needed? How do we get them the funds to do that? There are ways to do that. We're not going to talk about policy today, but I think as part of the effort to figure out what we're doing as a coalition, we have to recognize that. Then we have to recognize the issues on family farms. We have to have a set of narratives that we all understand and agree to, and developing those narratives, I think, is a critical part of the effort of building coalitions. So with that, I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. How many was that? 90, how many? 9,500, 9,700?
9,700 from those two trainings.
And that's those are just the new batch. There's a whole existing.
Well, of course, we've greatly expanded by doing virtual trainings, but we have about over 30,000 trained climate reality leaders now, and we have many more people in our chapters who aren't trained leaders. You know, we're ready to be an effective grassroots organization.
You think? I think you are. That's incredible. I hear this capacity everywhere, and it wakes me up from my slumber. I'll tell you that. Great. Well, thank you so much, Ken. To be continued. Next up, we have Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. It's very nice to meet you. I know that we haven't had a chance to connect before this, and I apologize for that. I would have loved to have. And so we welcome you. I think you could probably tell from the context of what we're talking about, and we welcome your thoughts. And we're just very glad to have you here. We included the Poor People's Campaign climate documents in our digest, our policy digest. Over a year ago, we've found that document along with WEAC's proposals and NAACP's proposals. So I feel like I've been connected to you for some time because we've relied upon your work. But we're very happy that you're here, and we welcome all your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to be in this conversation, and thanks for holding this. As Todd said, my name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. I'm the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Seminary, and I'm also the co-chair with Reverend Dr. Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. I was thinking some about the moment that we're living in, and therefore the kind of legislative agenda and coalitions that we're building. As I think folks are aware, there's 140 million people in the United States right now who are poor for one storm, one fire, one healthcare crisis, one job loss away from economic ruin. And this is only worsening, in this public health crisis, in this environmental crisis, and in this economic crisis that we're living through. We have these storms and these wildfires, these climate events that are wreaking havoc, and we know that those who are hurt first and worst by the devastation of the environment and climate change are poor and marginalized people. And so, the Poor People's Campaign was launched 3 years ago, and we do indeed have a set of agendas and policy prescriptions, many of which are coming from conversation we've had with groups that are here in this conversation, as well as out of the kind of frontline struggles of folks in Lowndes County, Alabama, who, have raw sewage in their yards, and folks in Oak Flat, Arizona, whose sacred native sites are being desecrated by copper mining multinational corporations, and who are feeling the brunt of whether it's the not just in Flint, Michigan, but the 4 million families who turned their taps on this morning and had poisoned water coming out. And so, out of that, we have launched the Poor People's Campaign, and we thought it was really important to include this crisis of the environment, this ecological devastation, in the interlocking injustices that this campaign is really focused on addressing. We see that you can't actually address any of the injustices of our society without taking on systemic racism and poverty, without taking on ecological devastation and climate change, without challenging the kind of militarization of our communities, the militarization of our world, and the war economy, and then also this distorted moral narrative, this narrative of particularly Christian nationalism. And so, we follow much of the work that folks here are doing, and believe that we have to really do two things in this moment as a part of a kind of larger agenda, and that's to shift the narrative on climate, the narrative on the solutions to the problems, the narrative on who can really make a difference. And we also really have to build power. And that's why coming together in groups like this with, a broad array of folks who, again, don't have to agree on everything, but who are building power from below is really the way that change can come across. I mean, I have this favorite quote of Reverend Dr. King's, and he says, "Our nettlesome task is to discover how to organize our strength into compelling power so that the government cannot elude our demands. It would be the height of naivete to wait passively until the administration had somehow been infused with such blessings of goodwill that it implored us for our programs." And I think about this every day, especially in the topic that was set aside for us to be taking up today. No, the administration, we're not sitting and waiting for them to applaud us for our demands. We're coming together with a broad fusion group of people and organizations and leaders and saying, this is the way. And that's part of, I think, how we can address this idea of a legislative agenda. We can't just simply curse the darkness. And that's why I'm so appreciative of the work that you all have done. We have to shine a light on what's possible. We have to pull these, solutions together, and then also show that it's not just morally correct to do this, but it's economically and environmentally possible and actually necessary. Like that the only way we can actually save the earth and everything that's living in it is by groups like us coming together and putting forth this broad set of demands. And so, we do have more. We don't need to, just like Ken Berlin didn't get into the specifics of policy. We're excited that you've included already a bunch of our agenda. That agenda, speaks to green jobs. It speaks to, banning mountaintop removal and fracking, but it also speaks to, making those who have destroyed our communities pay to fix them, and also, a whole set of again solutions that are coming out of impacted communities, and we do so again, by doing what we're doing here. How do we pull people together and be able to kind of build the power that is going to be necessary to actually, make an impact. And so I'm excited for the rest of this conversation and to be a part of all of this.
Oh, I'm just feeling uplifted. I'm feeling very inspired. You mentioned the war economy, and I talked to the peace activists that I work with. I said, if we can bring down the oil industry, the geopolitical rationale for war around the world will start to disintegrate from within. So I'm trying to get them focused on if you can make renewable energy happen and the oil industry implode, you will win a big part of your battle for peace and against the military industrial complex.
Exactly. Some of the biggest polluters.
Yeah, and we can't,
like the way that we see it.
That too, right? Exactly. Wonderful. It's so great to hear everything you have to say. I love hearing all the people who've been doing this for a little bit longer than me, because you have all the most beautiful wording and it just comes across. I'm just like, I come in and say, we're going to force Congress to do what we think needs to happen. But the way you said it made it sound so lovely. All right. Next up, we have Jerry Hinkle, Board of Directors for Citizens Climate Lobby, one of the original folks there. And Citizens Climate Lobby has always been the model example of how to organize around legislation through to the grassroots. You start with a real bill, and getting there is not an easy feat, and I know. And then you organize in the districts. And that's really, there's no magic to it beyond that. That's the basic ingredients. And they've been doing it, leading by example. So the prospects of us all joining forces with this kind of clear strategy approach, and then replicating that within our organizations and then linking together is just mind-boggling. So Jerry, welcome. Thank you, and Mark, for everything you're doing, and all your activists who show up in all of our open meetings, and I love them. And we're in a whole process about discussing that topic, which we won't get into today too much, I hope. But we welcome you, and we're so glad that Citizens Climate Lobby has emerged in the climate movement to drive this idea of federal legislation, and welcome.
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate you bringing this set of remarkable groups together that are all committed to something that I know I'm incredibly passionate about, really finding climate solutions for ourselves and for the world as a whole. Little bit about our national strategy. So let's start with an overarching objective. And the overarching objective is to get to something like net zero emissions globally, not just in the US, but globally by mid-century. Temperatures are going to continue to rise until we hit net zero globally. And it's at that point that we can really begin to stabilize climate risk. And that's the objective. The US is only 14% of global emissions. We can't do it alone. We are 1/7 of emissions. So the key imperative in the nearer term for us, and Todd, you've reflected this and the other groups have as well, is to pass, what we can do here in the US is to pass national legislation that will not only achieve that objective here at home, but we can then interface with the world, the other 6/7 of emissions, and use that to inspire and incent them to take very strong action as well. So I think that's what we're up to. How do you pass legislation that will inspire the world, that will move them to action? I believe that one critical element of that is durable legislation, which has got to be broadly supported. Okay, we're going to have to extend to the other side of the aisle, almost certainly. That's what we believe, because we want to turn to the world and show them that the US is in it for the long haul, not just until the next election cycle. So how do we do that? Two challenges in the near term. You've mentioned some of our strategy. I'll go over it very quickly for the rest. But for this coming year, we see two elements that are of particular importance. First of all, the Senate. There's a very good chance we need 60 votes in the Senate. Okay. Second, is this outreach to moderates and really conservatives. And the reason is that even if you needed 50 in the Senate, you're going to need some of those folks to jump on board to really have broad support. So we're a very all-inclusive organization, completely nonpartisan and very committed to hearing people, exchanging with people from a position of respect and appreciation for their views. And that includes people that aren't there yet on climate. And I think that's critical for us going forward. Okay. How do we go about this? Our primary model that you discussed, and I'll talk about it briefly, is this 5 levers of political will. What we want to do, we want to take an advocate and we want to optimize their capacity to influence Congress. We want to have their political expression be as strong as it can be. How do we do that? 5 levers. The first thing that we do with these folks is lobby. So we train them to build a respectful relationship with their own members of Congress. Yeah, and again, this year, we're going to focus a little bit more on the Senate. We're going to focus a little bit more on conservatives. Media, we train advocates to be able to influence the media. So produce letters to the editor, op-eds. We work with editorial boards. All forms of media, social media included. Grassroots engagement. So we recruit and educate the public on climate solutions, climate advocacy, and how to participate effectively with your government. Grass tops engagement. I want to underline this because it's also a special focus of ours this year. What we've seen is that when we go into a member of Congress's office, which we do about 1,500 times a year, is they're really interested in who's supporting this in my district. Okay, what businesses, what local leaders, what advocacy groups, what other advocacy groups are supporting this. So we need to reach out to those folks, talk to them about what we do generally, and even have them lobby with us. That's been really effective. We got to do a lot more of it. And then finally, we just do local group development. Our local groups, all politics is local. All right, I'll wrap up pretty quickly here because I want to get to the question of how are we organized to achieve this nationally. I'm going to assert that critical to very broad collaboration building is a common shared objective. And we have that and we can build around that. And it's generally this addressing climate change in a very strong manner in the US and this goal of net zero emissions by 2050. I think, you start with that and the rest is of secondary importance. The other differences that we may have are of secondary importance. And we can all work to interact with our local legislators, our national legislators, and ask them to do whatever they can to help achieve this imperative objective of net zero by 2050 and to do it in 2021. The time is now. We are behind the 8 ball. It's cost us. We're seeing that out west especially. We're seeing it in the Midwest. We're seeing it on the Gulf Coast. We've got to get to it now. And I'll end there, Ken. Thank you. You're muted, buddy. There you go.
That was wonderful, Jerry. Thank you so much for laying all that out there. I love things that sound like a game plan. It's so hard to get there sometimes. And it's ultimately not rocket science, but we just have to agree to do it. You mentioned common shared objective, and that's why MIT and Project Drawdown, I'm so excited about their willingness to have the scientists evaluate proposed legislation based on the projected greenhouse gas reduction impacts. That wouldn't be the only lens, of course. EJ and just transition lenses would be applied, but at least we would have an objective scientific body looking at all of our bill, or our comprehensive bill, and telling us, yeah, we think you will get this much reduction by this date, and here's how we're gonna monitor it. And that might give us a shared frame of at least common language and shared goal. And then you fill in the pieces and see how it measures and adds up. All right, next up, we have Peggy Shepard, Executive Director of We Act for Environmental Justice. One of the, I don't know how to say it, most inspirational and core groups in New York City and probably beyond, and helping to drive this conversation and how it impacts local communities. And I think we're in this conversation where we are because of We Act and other groups like it. So Peggy, welcome so much. It's a pleasure to meet you. I feel like I've known you indirectly for some time. So welcome and thank you.
So thank you, Todd. You've probably known us for a while because the National Environmental Justice Movement has been operating and organizing for over 30 some years now. And, you know, our main goal was to go home and organize a grassroots base and to be decentralized because we speak for ourselves. And in many instances, that may be why we have not been as visible, because we have not had centralized leadership, because we want all of our voices to be heard. So for many years, we have reached out to the national green groups around the policies that they were pursuing that we felt did not always benefit our communities. And so about 3 years ago, we were able to develop a collaboration with 6 national green groups and 11 environmental justice organizations. And we developed something called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. And it's really a bold national climate policy agenda that advances the goals of economic, racial, climate, and environmental justice. And it really lays a foundation to improve the way we can work together and to advance equitable policies, but commit to working through continuing differences like cap and trade, for instance. We won't get into policy today, but we've really challenged ourselves to advance solutions that involve and value the positions of frontline communities and repair the legacy of harm. You know, one issue I've had with the explosion of climate organizations that have sprung up in the last 5 or so years is that the message to the public is about carbon reduction and not about the ways that the climate crisis will impact all of their lives and their households. And as a result, we have not had the broad public support for climate policies that we need. And I think many organizations have now realized that without really cultivating that grassroots base of support, because as I think Jerry Hinkle just mentioned, when you go on the Hill or talk to an elected official, the first thing they want to know is, what's your address? Do you live in my district? Are you a voter in my district? And so it's very important that people see, especially elected, see the people who are voting for them, not simply the more so-called professional advocates, but they want to see the grassroots people who are in their districts. And so the way we began to work together was that the environmental justice groups came together and developed a platform. Now, that didn't take us a lot of time because we've known what we've needed for 30 years and have not been able to get that into effective policies. And so we developed that platform, and in over 1.5 years, we then began to work with the staff and the CEOs of 6 green groups to wordsmith and really finalize the document that the environmental justice community had put forth to come to a consensus on key issues, and again, to figure out where we still had differences. And in that 1.5 years, we had a variety of meetings so that we could get to know each other and build trust. Because one thing that we understand is that there has been a strong erosion of trust because our voices have been left out of any of the policy debates. And so building that trust has been very important. And then again, as a coalition, making commitments to each other. So commitments such as the Green Groups committing to equity training, to really understanding the issues of equity and embedding them throughout their organizations, reviewing their projects and their upcoming policies to ensure that there is an equity lens. And then again, also fundraising to help support some of the environmental justice groups that have very little capacity because we've been so under-resourced. There are numbers of studies that show that out of the $23 billion or so in philanthropy that goes to environment, only 1% goes to the environmental justice communities. So when we go to the Hill and people say, well, gee, where have you been? We never see you. Well, you know, it takes money to get to Washington. You know, I live in New York City, and to go to Washington for an early morning meeting is about $800 for a hotel and an Amtrak train. So again, people don't understand, why don't they see our voices there? Because again, the resources aren't there to fund people to get to Washington, to talk to their elected officials, except in their district offices. So another issue that we've worked on in order to ensure that we have a stronger national platform, we had a process called the 5 tables. And I'll just conclude by saying we've had several meetings with 5 different platforms, climate platforms, to understand where we have strong alignment and where we still have differences that we need to address. And again, that's been our process to try to develop alignment with the numbers of platforms out there, the Green New Deal, the Climate Action Campaign, the Blue-Green Alliance, the US CAN, so that we can really begin to come together on the Hill and in Congress around these issues.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Peggy. So it's just been an inspiration to see this topic take hold and be embraced. I come from the gay rights movement, and I still feel like we're all alone fighting our battles. And so watching the dominant culture embrace minority concerns and communities and lift those up. It was after this, the last nightmare election moment that we went into the streets in New York, and I finally saw signs for the first time that had, racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia all listed as one by some, one of those members. And I was like, oh, at least this is happening. So I understand what it feels like to be excluded and then to be embraced. And I see it as a sign of a silver lining of this nightmare that we are coming together at this level as a humanity. So you just make me excited. So in the next round, if you could dive in a little bit more into your process that you went through and any advice you might have for us and for the whole journey ahead about what kind of process we could go through to really unite at the macro level in an open and transparent way that's inclusive, not because somebody got a special invite, but because we really opened it up from the bottom and from the beginning rather. Next up, we have Lisa Van Susteren. She's on the steering committee for Climate Psychiatry Alliance. We had a wonderful conversation, a long conversation the other day, and we talked about minority stress, which our community and all minority communities suffer. It's a whole realm of psychological analysis. It's very informative. And so I forget where we left off in our conversation about how you were going to plug and wrap this all together. But if any cause and any coalition building needs and could benefit from psychiatry, I think this is it. So welcome, and please, we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Todd. I hope I can deliver on your expectations. It is a tangled sort of situation. First of all, everyone should know that it's crazy to say this. because what could cut across everything more than human behavior in this particular realm? But there is no climate and mental health community organization with paid staff. What we have are a couple of groups that have been organized, and it's all around volunteer contributions. So what we do can be very nimble, and we can understand each other very quickly, not necessarily agree, but there is a certain ease with which we can target particular actions. The downside is, of course, that we haven't been good at scaling what we can do. And everything that you have spoken about, all of us have spoken about today, there isn't a single thing that doesn't cause some emotional harm or injury. It doesn't matter if you can't get along with someone who's on another coalition, if your house was burned down from a wildfire, if a job was lost, if there was a diversity and equity, no matter what it is, this creates a psychological or an emotional harm. And so this presents then for us enormous opportunities. And to me, when I look at where we are today, I think to myself that this community, the mental health community, has largely left the power of its expertise on the table. And when we have reached out, now I say we, because we have formed several groups, and those several groups, first of all, is the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, the Climate Psychology Alliance, and recently the Social Climate Leadership Group. And just yesterday, I was working on the the Climate Social Workers Alliance, and we have made connections internationally. So here's what we are attempting to do. First of all, we've tried to organize under the HEMES principles so that we can get along. And many of us being mental health professionals, we understand each other's quirks, and we're sometimes better at dealing with them than we might be under ordinary circumstances. And we do try to resolve our conflicts openly or indirectly, thank God, because we have them. And this is not a group of activists by nature. These are people who have picked up on what is brewing, recognizing, think about it, that what we are expecting in terms of climate disasters is something that is going to take us down psychologically, socially, like nothing else. And the cascade, the cumulative toll, well, how the hell are we always going to get out of bed in the morning and be able to do what we got to do when we know, certainly for a while, that things are only going to get worse? Well, we've got to have a plan. And we're not good at strategy generally, this group, but we're trying. And I'll talk about some legislation in a minute. So one of the things that we're doing, which contrasts with what we do in our personal, professional lives, which is we wait for patients generally to come to us, we've tried to change the thrust, to reach out to groups, to ask them if they will build a coalition with us that gives us an opportunity to go to state legislatures, especially the red and purple ones, to talk to their environmental health committee. We've formed a referral group of climate aware therapists. So many people look to us for help who are devastated and despair and angry and paralyzed, some of them. And they go to a therapist who thinks it's something to do with an early life experience with their moms. They do not understand. So we have reached out there. What we have also done that I'm extremely proud of, because I think it really does address something that we collectively have left on the table. And that is what grabs people. What's the hook in a song? What's the hook in a movie? What's the hook in a book? What do advertisers know about marketing? How do they know how to make a sale? Well, one of the things that we are asking for and have gone to Representative Schakowsky from Illinois with, she recently introduced the Future Generations Act, is that we have asked for a hearing, on climate and mental health and with a special emphasis on what's happening to young people. And the group asking for this is everybody's on the same level. It is a coalition of people. And so we are hoping that this is something which will have legs and can filter and push into one of the things we're asking for, the Mental Wellness and Resilience Act, about which we can talk later.
Wonderful. I love this, how we went from the psychological issues and you segued seamlessly into turning psychiatrists into lobbyists. And you have a plan, you have something that you want, you have an ask, which is really, believe it or not, some of the times the hardest thing to do. And you found a niche, clear ask, and already you're just mobilizing your folks. And if a comprehensive bill comes together, then I could just imagine that. And we had the physicians on the other call and the teachers on another call. And so you start to see the picture of how we're going to grow out from and expand into the other professions. I'm keen on figuring out where the lawyers are. And so anyhow, this is great. It's very exciting. Thank you so much. All right, for the next round, we have 2-minute windows for responses, and we'll just keep going around in the same direction. I don't know if Jake's still with us. He had to leave for a transition meeting at 1. Is he still here? No, he's gone. So that's fine. He'll be back. So that's okay. We'll take everyone else out of turn. So let's see. So I guess if we're starting with Cornelius, if you could share some of the what are they called? Like sort of like foundational constructs of cooperatives, and how that ideology or philosophy of organizing could help inform our journey uniting. That would be wonderful.
Great, Todd. So Todd, let me start with what a cooperative is for anyone who doesn't know. And simply put, a cooperative is a jointly owned and democratically controlled business made up of a number of individuals who have come together around a common need. So to that common good concept that we've been talking about, but folks who have come together to meet a common need, a common challenge that they have, and through an enterprise that they jointly own and control. All right, now, there are 7 principles to cooperatives, and I'll state them just briefly. Voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, constant education, cooperation among cooperatives, and concern for community. And I say those things, but I want to stop on 3 of them in particular: democratic member control, constant education, and concern for community. And that democratic member control, because it talks about the ownership and the democratic control, the nature of ownership within these structures. And many folks have talked about grassroots community engagement and getting the grassroots folks involved in this. And you do that through them having a voice in this, having ownership, having a stake. And so I mentioned that principle as one, but also constant education. I started out talking about sometimes the lack of common language that we use, the lack of education around these issues and how it relates to the various communities, our communities, and each other. So really being able to have constant education around all of these issues. And then concern for community. Cooperatives are structures that are embedded in their communities, and because the folks who come out of those communities own those structures, they're also parts and members of that community and own parts of that community. And so it's a natural transition among all of it. So that's the basis or the construct of a cooperative. Now the Federation, we are a cooperative of cooperatives. We are a cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives. So we're structured from the sense where we pay attention to, we know that those cooperatives are made up of individuals. We pay attention to those individuals and their needs, because you can't treat, you can't serve, you can't support a cooperative without supporting those individual members, dealing with those individual concerns. You have individuals that make up that collective group. And so dealing with that individual as a starting point, then secondly, dealing with that cooperative. And for us as a federation, we're structured by those individual members, those cooperatives, and then what we call state associations, those cooperatives working together in their state, because they have common issues, common challenges that they work on that might be different from other states. So as an example, in Mississippi, we have 22 cooperatives that make up the whole federation, 75 total. But those cooperatives in that state, they have their own structure, their own board, and they deal with things from a statewide level. And they send one person to represent them. Each one of those cooperatives has a representative on that state level, and then that state sends one person that they elect amongst themselves to represent them on the regional or the federation level. So we're structured from an individual level, from a primary cooperative, a secondary cooperative in those states, and then a tertiary cooperative, which being the federation, that cooperative of cooperatives. And then we all come together. They come together at different times throughout the year to meet. Those individual co-ops meet themselves. The states meet a few times out of the year. But then once a year in August for our annual meeting, all of those cooperatives, all of those members come together. And at that time, we talk about all the issues that the co-ops face, the issues that the state face, and then we find that common area that the region, that we as a federation work on. And so the staff, our staff, my staff, our job is to put that into language, come up with our plan for the year, and then we support that federation of cooperatives, that cooperative of cooperatives, that common good. Then we support that each year based on what we've talked about over 3 days during our annual meeting. So that's our structure. That's how we're organized. That's how we deal with the issues. We're nothing more than a coalition of cooperatives, a coalition of Black farmers, coalition of these landowners. And so we have a structured way of supporting those members. We also have a structured way of getting to the issue and defining the work that we do for the year. And so I would say that, and I want to end by saying this, and this is from some of the earlier conversations we had, just really in terms of understanding how getting a lot of stakeholders involved. When you talk about the rural population of our country, the Black rural population, 90% of that is in the South. 90% of the rural Black population is in the South. And so, and I think really understanding the issues of the South and really understanding the issues of the Black population within the South is going to be crucial to really dealing with finding the common good and dealing with the things. And I think Dr. Liz talked about in terms of her work around the Poor People's Campaign and looking at structural racism, because there's a lot of that as apparent. And those things like our issue around heirs property, as an example, is a big issue that Southern landowners deal with. And it is a barrier to really looking at a lot of things, especially climate change, because again, you have to start with land, and land is being lost based on some structural racism and structural blocks and policies that are in place that can be easily dealt with, and especially as a coalition. But it has to be seen as a climate change issue among many other things as well. So I'll stop there, Todd. I probably took up way too much time.
That's okay, Cornelius, because we try to be tight on time, but we're also more interested in the substance, and that was some substance. So there's always time for substance that's on point. Well, I just get giddy, and I'm like, okay, Cornelius, come organize the coalition of coalitions, the co-op of co-ops for us, because it's a finesse, it's a gift, it's a mentality, and so I think what you do is invaluable to our next level of convening and convergence. And not today, but I'd be curious to see how that's working all online. And just all those elements, democracy, openness, all of these issues are just beautiful. And these are the thematics that I think are the foundation. So, okay, I could follow you and ask you a million follow-up questions, but we'll move on and we'll see if we get around again. Ken, let me see. I was so listening intently, I didn't think about what I might ask you to follow up with, but I guess I would just, you have 30,000 folks trained already. That's unbelievable. Can you envision how these might merge? could we have a common lobby day, even if we're all going to lobby different things or, slightly different pieces of the pie, so to speak? How might that align? So we get CACL and all these groups basically, okay, we're going to have a lobby day April 1st or whatever, date we pick. We were talking to Congress about the schedule next year. So we're obviously looking at a medium-term plan with drafting a comprehensive bill. But in the short term, we're building infrastructure, of course, that conversation, like what Cornelius was just talking about. And then at the same time, no one's waiting for any of that to come into existence. We're going to push ahead and forge ahead now. And there are a whole suite of bills, the Environmental Justice for All Act, the Justice for Black Farmers Act. There's a whole suite of bills that we've packaged. So we're ready to mobilize by congressional district around a package of bills as a prototype for this unity that we will then forge more deeply and around a bigger demand. So how would you see, I'm not mean to put you on the spot, do you think we could merge these operations at least at a macro level? So like every 3 months or every whatever it is, we have a common lobby day, for example. You're muted again, Ken.
I think if we can do that, it would be critically important and very, very helpful. And one way I look at it, start with the question, which is, we're in a situation where 70% of the country pretty much says they want action on climate change. And yet we not only don't get it, but at least as of today, we have a whole political party that's opposing doing it, although I'm very hopeful we can change that. So why when 70% of the country wants something, aren't we getting it? I think the answer is that with Congress, you've got to really show congressmen two different things. One, as Jerry said, you've got to show them that the people in their community want this to happen. You've got to go out and you've got to say that these groups are doing that and this. And the best way to do that is for us to come in with a bunch of coalitions on the same day, a bunch of groups on the same day, if we can do that. Meet with them and say, look, this is one aspect of why our community does it. Then we get, another group from the community, another group, and another group. They have to see that the activists out there are serious enough. They're going to work against them. They're going to push for this issue. And the more people we have doing that, and the more different groups we have doing that, the better. The second aspect, which is harder, is that I don't think politicians care too much about polls that say 70% of people want action. They want to know that people regard climate change, in this case, or the climate crisis, as a critical issue. I just saw a recent set of polls that was done after the election, done by environmental groups, that really came out and said that climate change is still, again, while everybody wants it, it's ranking only as the fourth or fifth and even the sixth most important issue in people's minds. We have to elevate that to climate change being in the top 3 issues in people's minds. It didn't come in as high as the economy, the COVID crisis, which will obviously drop out eventually. So we can do that. We're not that far from getting there. But to do that, again, we all have to work together and figure out how we can reach out to the public. And, you can't reach out to people that easily individually, but you do have things that happen where we can all work together. We really haven't pushed action, for example, after major hurricanes and major events. Maybe we need to start thinking about, making people that we can take advantage of these things to make people realize that they've got to work on that. And again, the more we can all do this together, or at least with a common strategy, the better off we are. How do we reach out? How do we do the kind of media work again that Jerry was talking about? How do we get enough of that so that we start moving enough people so that climate change is thought of in Congress as a top 3 issue? So it's a combination of getting people to actually appear before their congressman or congresswoman, as many groups as possible, with as much information as possible about support of the district, and then just in the polls, getting the polls to show that climate change is a top 3 issue to people. We're close to that. We've got to push ourselves across the line. And I think if we work at it together, we'll have a much better chance of doing that.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken. All right, I won't do a follow-up, but the thought in my mind is, if we have a comprehensive bill, an earth bill, I like to use the word earth bill, and I keep using everyone, all right, together, heave, is what earth stands for in my mind. So if we had a bill like that, your folks would be, motivated, right, to go do that lobbying.
Absolutely. We would set up, we plan to set up lobby days and do all that. I'm sure many of the groups here are planning to do that. The question is, can we coordinate them so that the individual lobby days have a greater impact by a bunch of groups working together?
And way we're approaching that is by organizing within district right now, many like MINI coalitions across the sectors. And so I think we can start to build that those relationships now, so we can connect Climate Reality to the local Sierra Club chapter with the local Unitarian Universalist chapter, which we have a lot of groups in our network already. And the faith community has its whole session next, and they're ready to mobilize in Republican districts, the United Church of Christ. The first things out of their mouth was, we have lots of power in Republican Senate districts. And I was like, ding, ding, ding. So anyway, you get the idea. We could start to organize that ground game by uniting our activists on the ground and then empowering them to work together. And we have astute organizers at that level, and they could build their own mini coalitions in district from all of our constituents. So, all right, I'm getting excited. I'll calm down. I'm having a second cup of coffee because I didn't get enough sleep and I don't drink the stuff. So get ready. I'm ready now. Jerry, you're up.
Great, thanks, Todd. Fabulous discussion. I want to start with so broad coalition building. I think Cornelius did just a fabulous job of talking about the how. How can you make such a broad coalition work? And I want to underline again a little bit about the what. I want to suggest at least that you start, if you really want a broad coalition, you want it to stick together, you're going to have to get a little bit general. What can we all agree upon? This is a wonderful group. This is a very diverse group. That's great. We need a big tent because we need everybody, and we need everybody because there's a lot of money on the other side. There's a lot of influence. Never kid yourself about who we're up against here. Okay, so we need all of us. How are we going to get all of us? And let's consider that what we're aiming for is national legislation that achieves an objective that we would be appreciative of, that could get through the Senate. So I think we want to stay general on that front. It's funny, I'm trying to answer questions in the chat. CCL doesn't poo-poo nuclear. We don't. Okay, so someone's off from that. Somebody else, well, is it strong enough on the EJ front? So it's very easy to lose people the moment that you get specific. But I think we all get the climate crisis. We all want to get to something like net zero by 2050. So maybe we start with that as a rallying cry. I want to say one other thing about EJ. Here's what we know from the peer-reviewed science. Climate benefits, climate impact disproportionately falls on the poor and the most vulnerable. You take strong climate action, you disproportionately benefit them. Financial benefits. So it's the only thing I'll ever say about policy. If you raise a bunch of funds by making polluting expensive and you return those funds to families, the poor do really well. The poor do really well. So that's just something to keep in mind. Finally, there's tremendous. We've calculated them at $700 billion every year. Health benefits from strong climate policy. There are very strong net benefits to climate policy, and they disproportionately go to the poor. So there's a way to, by addressing climate, we do really well for those most vulnerable in society, and let's remember that. Gosh, I hate to, but I'll stop there. I hope I get a chance to talk again. Todd, take it away.
You might make it around again. We'll see. Thank you, Jerry. And I have to apologize because Reverend Liz, I didn't take you in order. I apologize. Please.
All good. I'm not worried.
So
I'm enjoying the conversation.
You folks are like the coalition of coalitions, the behemoth of coalitions, and as I understand it anyway. So, give us your wisdom about how hard that is to do, and the role of faith leaders and being a convener. And because we're gonna have a whole faith conversation in the next one, and I feel that there's a gravitas there, a moral authority that can help bring warring factions together. So, any insights on that and the challenges that we might face? We don't want to get too much. Whatever wisdom you have to offer us on this beginning journey.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. So just to say a little bit actually of how the Poor People's Campaign is organized, because I think there's a lesson there for how you deep, broad, real coalitions. And so the Poor People's Campaign is organized in 45 states. We have coordinating committees, and those coordinating committees are led by poor and impacted people, moral leaders and clergy, and other advocates and activists. And they represent a real diversity across, all the lines where we're divided in our society. And this is really important, to our work, but I think to actually effective coalition. And we would actually talk about a fusion movement more than a coalition, right? Where coalition means that often people come together, it's transactional. When people have won something, then a lot of people kind of disband it. And what we see is that we actually need we need permanently organized communities, and we need a movement from the ground up that can kind of overcome, not ignore, in fact, really center the divisions that have plagued our society so much, but then bring people together across those divisions around, these bold visionary policies. And so again, and how we started and how we're organized is really from the bottom up. We did not go to all of the different big organizations, whether it was on civil rights or environmental issues or around, children or around anti-poverty. We started with people on the ground and built up a state infrastructure. We talk about being a national movement, but we're only national in that we're nationalizing state-based and local-based movements, right? A lot of times when we talk about a national organization or a movement, it means that you have a PO box in DC, and we do plenty of work in DC. But again, it's national because it's made up of people across all of our diversity in this nation that are living here. And so I think what we have learned is that when you start with the needs and demands of those that are most impacted by injustice, and you build up an infrastructure around that, that opens up a table that actually is really broad and really wide, and then can welcome in people from all walks of life that way, but around, certain priorities that cannot be, undone or ignored. And I think, that also is really important. It means that you have to do a bunch of the hard work. I mean, we start with the issue of racism, right? Because an original sins of this nation is racism. It's U.S. chattel slavery. It's the mistreatment of indigenous communities, and we talk about systemic racism if we're in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky or if we're in the inner city of Chicago. And we talk about it the same because we know that it's really important to actually undo racism, including if we're going to have an effective environmental justice movement, that you have to take on these issues, and also geography, right? What we have found is that some of those 4 million families that have poisoned water, some of those 15 million families that can't afford water, the places that are being impacted by all kinds of environmental chaos. Some of it's small towns, some of it's big cities, but people are being disproportionately impacted if they're poor, if they're marginalized, if they're people of color. And how do you see actually that there's a connection between Cancer Alley in Louisiana and the folks that are living in the Bronx and some of the most polluted places as well. And there is. And so then the last thing around faith, I know I've talked for a minute too long. I apologize for that. But is, in this kind of building of power and in this shifting of narrative, the lie that this is as good as it gets, that we have to choose whether we're going to protect the environment or whether we're going to protect the economy. Those are false dichotomies. They are false. And so having people from all walks of life, but including from various faith traditions in there, talking about, what our sacred texts say is that we should protect this world and everything living in and on it. And that brings a moral authority for sure. It also brings, deep organization. I mean, we have, in the Poor People's Campaign, about 20 national faith bodies whether it's Hindus, whether it's Muslims, whether it's different groupings of Jewish folks, as well as a whole array of Christian, faith bodies, like folks representing millions of people, right? Who all come together and say, we can agree that to address the injustices in our world today, we're going to unite around racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this distorted narrative. And doing so, really unites instead of divides.
Thank you. This is so exciting. There are so many themes that I would love to pick up on, but they're just so beautiful. It's so rich and it's so perfect. But this idea that we're going to organize in community and build community. I come from the LGBT community, and we have a radical fairy net community, which really, when I experienced community for the first time, holding space together, owning land together, having ritual together. And there's a whole nother magic that comes from community. And so it sounds like a lot of people are building community. And then if we could unite our communities at the district level, congressional district map level, and empower them to know one another, I think we would start to have an unstoppable force. And we're going to run out of time before we get to all this, but I just want to put out there the idea of translating all of our principles and vision statements into specific legislation, because that's how you call the question. That's how you give the litmus test for Congress. And that's how you get the fire in the belly that's really going to force change, is when you put pen to paper and come up with that. And it's not easy. Next, we have Peggy. Actually, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that journey, because there's a lot of macro organizing, a lot of, resolutions and principle statements. But how do we, how do we transform that into legislation that we can agree on and fight for collectively?
Yeah, and first let me say, I think Reverend Dr. Liz is a definite soul sister in all senses of that word. So the idea that we can have, Jerry talks about a very generalizing our climate platform. The problem with that is that you really cannot have climate justice without environmental justice. And climate change policies do not always get to environmental legacy issues. We know that extreme weather exacerbates the underlying legacy of pollution, yet most climate policy is not dealing with legacy pollution. And so again, when we talk about policies, we really need an equity screen. And Kamala Harris, when she was in the Senate, was introducing legislation about a climate equity screen for all policies, for all legislation, that really looks at key values and key contexts. And does this particular legislation reach that threshold? We know from years of work that the minute there is an environmental justice or policy that really impacts frontline communities, that is what is left on the cutting room floor when the negotiation happens at midnight. Our stuff is always cut out. And it is allowed because generally the national advocates, they want a win, and they're willing to take that win while leaving other things behind. But it's always communities of color and frontline communities that are left behind. So that is why we got to be much more specific. For instance, when the Biden administration talks about 40% of certain environmental benefits going to frontline communities, well, how is that going to be administered? If it's administered the way the stimulus funds were administered to small businesses, none of the small businesses got it. So we don't want administration as usual. If it's administered as usual, groups in the South, where Cornelius is, aren't going to get any of it because it's going to go to the state of Alabama or Mississippi. And you've got groups on the ground there that have suffered from Katrina that still haven't been made whole because that money did not go to that neighborhood. It went to the more affluent neighborhoods. And we've got to be very, very intentional. Otherwise, it will not get to the frontline communities that need it. And how do we know that? Because it's never happened so far.
Thank you, Peggy. And I just want to mention the Off Fossil Fuels Act that was drafted with the Climate Justice Alliance and others. And it had a provision in it that created a advisory council at the federal level that was frontline people of color communities, indigenous communities, and it gave them the power of the purse over the disbursement process for all federal funds that related to climate. And that's how you reverse that fortune. You put the minority communities in charge of the purse, just as an example. And I thought that was a brilliant.
Let's see how that goes. Let's see when that happens. Let's see how that happens.
We got 45, we got every congressional Democrat in New York except Tonko to sponsor that bill. And AOC committed to sponsoring it. And it was a foundational document. And so I think we can easily fight that fight if we put that in the mix. But and then the Church World Service is doing some beautiful work about EJ lenses and for the Biden administration's plans. And so everything. So there are ways that all of these can come together, I think, in a beautiful soup and salad. And they're not mutually exclusive. We can have specific scientific-based targets, and then we can have overlays. But anyway, we're getting down to nitty-gritty, but I see that it all will come together, really. I feel it. Lisa, tell us how we merge all these passions, and what are the emotional and psychological pitfalls of ego and brands and, whatever emotional pitfalls there are in terms of coming together.
Well, we could go on for a long time about that. You're absolutely right. And an important point. One thing, though, coming together is remembering that we can say things right up front that bring us all in the same place. And I have found that when I say we are a nation of traumatized people, that when we say these things, so we're walking into a lobbyist's office, we're walking into a meeting, the minute we say something that recognizes the emotional state of the other person, if you do a brain scan, you'd already see that they were open to yes, because you recognized what you have in common, and it's a very profound state of mind. So we are all traumatized by what's been happening, and we will be traumatized about future things. Some people you can talk to about climate specifically. Some people it's EJ. Some people it's Islamophobia or homophobia or racism generally. All of these things unite us. And of course, climate. But finding that common ground, which is that we are traumatized and we need to be ready. So I'm going to make a plea. First of all, look at the HEMES principles of democratic organizing. You can always go back to it when there's dissension. Much of the work that is done, that is completed, is done, in my experience, by going back to the HEMES principles and saying, remember, everyone was going to speak for himself. We were going to work by consensus. We were going to be respectful, putting that the equivalent of on the refrigerator so people can see something written. This is the organizing principle no matter what. And that's a very important one. The third thing is, I would like to ask this group, and this is a little bit off, but I do know that we have left, and I said this earlier, the real skills of social behavioral psychologists on the table. And to that end, we need, first of all, a platform so that we can ally with you to bring some of future harm that is coming to people that they have to be aware of, and to look at the resilience coordinating councils that we are hoping to create within communities. And the third thing is, can we be with you on a lobby day, maybe when we have our hearing on young people, mental health and young people, where we will talk about not only climate, but other things. And one last request, there will be a national climate director. We need a very nimble group within that national climate office that addresses us, that has a strategy of messaging and includes faith leaders as well as behavioral psychologists.
Lovely. Thank you for that. I do think this issue of setting aside ego and the self, being aware of the role that it plays in our emotional reaction to other people and to our ability to come together or not, is a topic that we need to pull out of the background and bring into the foreground. Although I have to say, in these conversations of the last few days, I'm less concerned about that, but maybe everyone's just on their best behavior. But when it gets to the nitty gritty, it's not so easy. And so there are these things: institutional power, political access, the individual career mentality, where my network and my relationships are paramount to the collective. These are challenges. And so I just would like to keep us in the conversation when we move forward. I think it's simpler if we put that out there as an issue and we talk about it a little bit rather than just allow it to manifest without any framework. I'm just thinking this off the top of my head now.
And, well, may I add, when you say trauma, that is a leveler, because everyone does then admit, yes, we've been traumatized. And it brings people off their high horse if they're swaggering around about how much more important their group is or they are or whatever it is. And when you mention young people, what you do is you're able to guilt trip people. And that also brings them down. And I will deny I said this as a psychiatrist, but guilt tripping can be extremely effective. So those are two ways to get people in the room and to stop their high horsing around.
Very interesting. I love the earlier, Jake's gone, but he coined the phrase bipartisan despair. I think we could call it bipartisan trauma, and that might help everyone understand that we're in this together. My community knows trauma, and it's never ending. We still don't have the Equality Act passed, so we have no civil rights protections in America still. And I would just also put out there again, like we did yesterday, comprehensive immigration reform, which is the first priority of the Biden administration. I think it's an interesting example of how we might all put our power where our concepts are to get behind that bill and use it as a little test case for how we can organize collectively for something that doesn't maybe personally affect us, but would set the stage for beautiful collaboration going forward. And put some skin in that game so that we're not just talking collaboration, but we're doing it. That was a total tangent. Sorry about that. All right. It's 1:43, so we have time for another round, I think. And maybe it needs to be a little bit quicker round. So we're having such a great conversation. I don't know that I want to steer it too much. I just want to maybe open all of you up, open it up to general comments, but I am interested in any insights you have about how we transform policy, big ideas into legislation. And, my dream is to get everybody's legislative directors together in one room and have them connected to your policy team, but without them in the room, I have to admit, and communicating, of course. And we sort of at least get the lay of the land. What does everybody want? What does everybody not want? I've worked through many consensus processes, and it's really about the journey that you take together. And if you say we're taking everyone's input, we're going to have that be transparent, what everybody submitted, and then we're going to merge it all together, so you can see how the overlaps, and put that back out there. Then people start to see where we agree and where we disagree, and then we can chart paths for the disagreement conversations and agree to disagree before we go into it, and then even at the outcome, maybe there'll be different camps. So I see that there are pathways. They just have to be managed properly and be inclusive and transparent. But I would love to hear any other lived experiences on this journey that could get us up on the right start. So how about we go backwards up the trail this time, and we'll go back to Peggy, because she's she's in this thick of this. And this could also be, if that's okay, you're muted, Peggy. And this could be sort of our wrap ups too a little bit. I think we might have another moment for a 30-second closing later.
One thing about a broad comprehensive bill is that the committees in Congress are parsed very narrowly. And so some things that we might feel should be in a comprehensive climate bill would not be necessarily appropriate for a particular committee or a particular legislator. And then we've got the lobbyists. So a lot of the work that we want to do is transitioning away from fossil fuels. And of course, we've got the oil and gas lobbyists, and we're still giving subsidies to many of those facilities. So again, we can craft the best bill possible, and it gets torn apart because of different lobbyists, lobbying our elected officials, the different geographic issues. If you've got the folks in Appalachia, they've got certain priorities that do not fit with perhaps some of the broader climate priorities. So the problem is that what happens is we put together the bill we want, and then the compromise starts. And then what gets left out? And what gets left out is generally what concerns the people who have the least amount of power and resources. And so,
Peggy, oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, is that we have to lock this down, that we're in it for the whole, and then we're in it for pieces as they move, but we're in it for the whole together, and we're not going to go home. In the gay rights movement, the straight white gay boys kept telling the transgender people, oh, we'll come back for you. We'll come back for you. Well, that doesn't happen. It just doesn't. And so I've shut down some major bills that we're about to pass that we're going to leave out transgender people. I'm like, no, we're not going to do it because you'll go home, and then the rest of us will be standing here with no power. So we'll have to talk about this very much up front about how we're going to lock down our collective goal and how we're going to stick together through the end. No one left behind. So, all right, very exciting. Sorry, I cut you off. Were you finished with your thought though? Okay. All right.
no, that's fine. No community left behind.
Yes. Hallelujah. We're going backwards now. I'm confused. I think now, Jerry, you get to go how to turn the other way. Well, we'll just go to Reverend Liz since we did that last time. Reverend Liz, you're up next.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to kind of jump in and both amen what Peggy was just saying. And was saying before as well. In our work, it's really important that when we're putting forward policies and legislative platforms, that we disaggregate the impacts of those policies to make sure that we know that no group is going to be left out, right? Like who is going to be impacted when you tax the fossil fuel industries, and pull that money back to communities. What's the racial demographic? What's the geographic demographic? Like who actually benefits from these policies, and who is hurt and left out of them, because too much of policies have happened in history's past, allowing for some good progressive wins, but that leaves whole sections of the population out. And so I just wanted to kind of amen that piece, and then just to speak about how do you take demands of a movement and make them legislative policy. I mean, that's the history of change in our society. That's and again, it's not it's not assuming that the administration is going to implore us for our demands, but putting out our demands, and then also showing how they're possible, and then from there being able to build up the power to make them say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. And so, again, that this is about, deep organizing. This is about having, folks, thousands and the millions in our communities, especially those who are most impacted by the injustices right now, who are at the ready to not just rally around a particular legislative agenda, but who are organizing all the time around these issues, and then saying, yes, this will lift the load here, or this will actually be the solution to our problems here. And not the other way around. That those demands and that organizing needs to come from below, and it has to be. We always say in our work that a legal strategy and a legislative strategy has to be connected to a strategy in the streets and in the community. and that you know, without any one of those three happening at the same time, you aren't gonna be able to bring about effective change and transformation.
Beautiful. Well, you just described exactly, this is climate lobby model, from legislation to the people. And I would just also add that we need to embed these solutions for EJ and just transition, embed them in the other ideas and plans. And every bill I've seen is doing that. Not every bill, but a lot of them. There's, anyway, we won't get into details, but there are farm bills that have, you know, issue. Anyway, we won't get into details.
No, I think that's really important, though. I mean, I think to see that you know, if we're going to have to build up the infrastructure of this country, because we've seen one of the things that this pandemic has laid bare is the ailing infrastructure of this nation, then we have to do so, you know, with green jobs, right? And if we're going to talk about you know, I mean, any of these different issues that there's a legislative agenda around, that they have to see the connections between housing and living wage jobs and protecting the environment and the expansion of voting rights, because all of those issues are actually connected. You know, and so I think that that's a really important. I think it doesn't. It only makes it stronger when you're taking on multiple issues in your legislative platform.
Lovely, thank you, Jerry. Please, you're up.
Thanks, Todd. I'm going to be quick, and I want to say thank you, because we've only got 8 minutes left. It's fabulous having a gathering like this and being able to speak to and listen to both the panelists and the 260 participants. Thanks for taking your time. Whatever you do when you leave this call, go out there and give them hell. Express your passion as fully as you can to your commitment that we handle the climate crisis. Please do that in whatever way, shape, or form it takes. Give it all you got. In that, we are brethren, we are brothers and sisters. So I thank you for that. I just want a couple of things. In our criteria of going forward, and I so appreciate Ms. Shepard's thoughts and your thoughts, Todd, and underlining that, leave no one behind. There's another criteria, which I don't know if it's challenging, and it's urgency. We want to get this done quick. We really need to get to this one. So let's just keep that in mind as we're developing the process. One other thing that I don't think is necessarily second nature, but could be critical to this, and it's very important to our organization, and that is to stand in the shoes of the folks that at least think that strong climate policy will disadvantage them. And there are people both that produce coal and that use coal, and there's a lot of those, okay? There's people that produce oil and they use oil, and they sometimes hear of such policies and they think, this will be bad for me, this will be bad for my family. And I think a place to start is to hear that and to have some compassion for it. Yes, we also need to say, these impacts are real, it's climate change, and they're gonna multiply. And if you're under 60, it's going to be really negative in your life, and your kids are going to have a hell of a time. So yeah, so let's stand in their shoes for just a minute in talking to them. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Next we have Ken. Go ahead, Ken.
Sorry, I do this like 10 times a day. I should remember to unmute. I also want to thank everybody. I think it's been a terrific panel. I just want to add a little bit to what Peggy said a minute ago, which is that I think that, you know, building the initial coalition behind a bill or a series of bills is relatively, it's hard, but it's relatively straightforward. It gets much more difficult when we hold the coalition together when it comes to the time of compromise. And, you know, and I think there are two ways to address that. One is, as I said before, I think we need to have a deep legislative strategy. It has to go beyond just the first bill. It's got to think and say, well, if X happens, what are we going to do? If Y happens, what are we going to do? And get consensus by the part of the, as much as we can on the, or at least the core consensus on what we have to do about that. The second thing is we have to build a narrative that we all accept in the environmental community, in this case, on the importance of addressing historical impacts of environmental injustice on communities of color and poorer communities. We've got to get that narrative built in deeply so that it affects the decisions we make when we're deciding on something. We can't give up. We can't make an environmental justice community bear the burden of the compromises we're doing. And we should have a narrative that makes that clear and makes people understand why. And also, we then have to work, I think, with the environmental justice community. We have to listen to them as environmental groups. We have to build trust with them. We have to amplify their voices. And we have to understand the steps we can take, again, with different contingencies to make sure that these communities are not left behind in the work we do. I think if we do that, we'll be mobilizing the people most affected by climate change to become active supporters and effective supporters of the work we're doing. So from the standpoint of environmental groups, it's important. And of course, it's a fundamental, major moral, humanitarian, and human issue we're talking about here. And we've got to tell those in the narrative. We've got to tell those stories about how people are being adversely affected by this. So
Thank you,
I'll stop with that.
We're talking to a marketing firm about all of this. We're going to bring the marketing industry in as a whole, like the media industry's got an initiative, the legal community has an initiative. We want the marketing industry to join as citizens and form a coalition of marketing industry corp companies to work collectively on how to message and how to bring our collective message to everyone in a more cohesive and penetrating way. So that will be another action step once we get rolling here. Next, we have Cornelius, and then I think, Lisa, you're going to wrap us up, and I'll just say goodbye at the end. I don't know that we'll have another round for the 2 seconds. We'll see, but go ahead, Cornelius.
Thank you. And as I wrap up, Todd, I want to say thank you to you again. Thank you to all the panelists. It's been a pleasure and an honor being on this panel with you all. And thank you to all those who are out there listening. Again, we appreciate having a seat at this table and having a voice in this conversation. I want to end with 2 things. And one is to reiterate that we must, again, understand the different perspectives, needs, and challenges of all those we hope to bring to the table and to the conversation. And back to Peggy's point about there are still communities that are left behind, frontline communities, communities in the South, communities of color. And she particularly mentioned Hurricane Katrina. And I bring this up because in the context of this understanding the differences and the different challenges, I go back to this heirs property situation. You have an heirs property situation in this country, especially in the Black community. And it is a barrier to folks getting access to disaster relief and other resources, which caused this issue that Peggy talked about in terms of these communities being left behind, these communities not being the one being able to get the resources. So we have to understand those issues as well, because those are political issues, those are legislative issues that we can tackle, and they lead the way to dealing with these environmental issues and others. So I want to put that out. In the second piece, I want to talk about really getting communities engaged and mobilizing support. And I want to reference to something that every single panelist has said here today in a number of different ways. We must quantify the value of protecting the environment and the impact that it has on communities. And I think quantifying that value really will get communities engaged from that perspective of understanding how they benefit from it, but also helping to mobilize support. So I end with that. And again, I say thank you. And it's been a pleasure being a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. And could you just explain to people, I know I read it on your website, but explain what this inheritance problem is just in 10 seconds. It's that there's no title because of the transfer of land. Go on.
Yeah. Thank you. In many communities, especially the Black community, you have this issue called heirs property. When someone who owns the land passes on and doesn't have a will or an estate plan, they leave the land behind to their heirs. And it's a situation where many folks own the land, but no one owns it. So there's no clear title. And in this country, to get access to government resources and various kind of resources, include loans and others, you have to have a clear title. And this is an unclear title situation. And we estimate that roughly 60% of the Black population doesn't have that has heirs property. And so you start talking about 90% of the population in the South being the Black population in terms of rural, you start talking about how this issue is exasperated. So this heirs property issue has been a big issue and a large reason for the loss of land in the Black community. But it's also it's a reason that many folks in these frontline communities, these communities of color, don't have access to these resources and don't benefit from them when they do come out. So that's it in the short term.
Yeah, people dying intestate essentially, and
Exactly.
chain of title is disrupted, and then it takes lawyers and all sorts of things to go and probate without an estate. So great. And the last, we'll have Lisa. Please wrap it up for us all. You do such a great job at all that.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to listen to everyone and hear so many different points of view that obviously lead to the same place, which is our working together. And we well know that as a collective voice, we're much more powerful than we are as single voices. So one of the embedded questions is, how do we get such differences with people's backgrounds and the people who are the egos and all of the other things? You know, we've all been in community organizing for a while. We know how painful it can sometimes be. Diversity obviously enriches us, but it also means that it can be fracture lines. So one of the things that I have found, and it sounds simple-minded, but the behavioral psychologists will say that before you ever get together, make sure that everyone has agreed on a set of principles. And I did put in HEMES Principles of Democratic Organizing. This was a group that met specifically to address economic and environmental injustice. And they hammered out the ways that they would get through some of their cultural and other differences. And something as simple, it sounds silly, but the behavioral psychologists will tell you, something as simple as upfront getting an agreement that you're going to play by a certain set of rules does bring out the better angels in people. So that is a place for us to start. And that is that we are all calling upon our better angels, knowing that, without saying the Lucifer effect right away, but knowing what the consequences are of failure. And that's not acceptable. So that's one place. So I'm happy that we're here together once again, understanding and bringing us, thank you, Todd, for bringing us together and recognizing how our common purpose is what takes us from that feeling of vulnerability to the feeling of empowerment that can restore us and heal our traumas.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a beautiful panel. It's so on point, and I'm really grateful. I'll just close by reminding everyone we have 2 more sessions, Faith from 3 to 5, Faith Networks and Indigenous, and they're already rolling down this path. So we're going to jump into that stream, and then we're going to talk to the direct action and mass mobilization, the People's Climate Movement, and Rise and Resist, Extinction Rebellion. And so just imagine when you have your lobby days all together, and then we're going to have a mass demonstrations in the street on the same day. Think about that. And we're not going to compromise when we draft it. We're going to set the dream goals, and we're going to fight for those. And then if we have to compromise somewhere down the line, we'll see but we're going to change the political power balance when we unite. And I don't think we're going to have to compromise so much anymore. If we all unite, we can make anything happen, I think. So with that, I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. This was beautiful and enjoyable. And oh, don't forget the Climate Cabaret at 8 o'clock. I'm going to sing a song if I have anything left in my voice, but we have some great cabaret stars from New York City who put that together. And so at 8 o'clock, just come back and please and enjoy it. And because it's more important that the cabaret, the singers, performers have an audience than we do, frankly. You know how they are. So we welcome you all back to that. And also January 13th, we just put a placeholder on January 13th at noon for maybe a reconvening. And when we'll bring our legislative directors with you. And let's just see what if we can get a conversation started about what the next steps might look like. It's all tentative, but placeholder. The hardest part of any meeting is scheduling the next meeting, as you all know. So that's why we're tossing that out there. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate participating.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thank you, Todd.
Nice to see you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.